It is a great pleasure to introduce you to Wandrè, to talk about his incredible life and his works, which also include basses and guitars. But these are not simple musical instruments, because they contain the right blend of idea, message, irony and transgression, that differentiates works of art from common objects. In fact, Wandrè's guitars are really works of pop art, sculptures that can be used for music. The place of our story is Italy, and particularly Cavriago, a very small village in the hinterland of Reggio Emilia city, in the region of Emilia-Romagna. This is a very lucky land, rich of creativity and genes of innovation. But it is also particularly fertile territory of sounds and music. In Cavriago, the 6th of June 1926, Antonio Wandrè Pioli was born. His father was a carpenter and very eccentric man, so he strongly influenced his songs for 3 reasons. Because he was an idealist, deserting for love during the First World War, sentenced to death and then pardoned. Because he was a dreamer and he spent all his money to build a flying machine. But especially because he was a clavier luthier famous for his double basses and guitars. But he made also very good violins and mandolins. You know, most people are thinking that Wandrè is a nickname. Actually, Wandrè is the real name of Antonio Wandrè Pioli, as you can read in the birth certificate. In the certificate, Wandrè is written with the V, and then Antonio turned it into a W when he was 14 years old. Nevertheless, Antonio had also a nickname. It was Gatina, that in the slang of Cavriago, it means little cat. So, his mother called him Gatina, because as a child Antonio had a great feeling with the animals, and particularly with cats. In 1941, Wandrè graduated at technical school and started to work at the Officine Reggiane, that was the greatest mechanical factory in Italy, with over 11,000 workers. Here, they were building especially trains and airplanes. This was a very important experience because here Wandrè learned all the secrets of the aluminum. In 1943 Wandrè enlisted in resistance, but he came out of the war destroyed because of violence. He was thinking that too many young people had died uselessly and that no idea or piece of land worth the life of a man. It was thinking that violence can only allow a mere substitution of power and that no revolution is possible without a preliminary revolution in people's consciousness. So, it became a pacifist, and for all his life he was finding freedom and peace. In 1946 Wandrè decided to back to school. He studied at the board school, Convito di Rivoltella, where he studied not only engineering, but also literature, math, philosophy, physics, art, sociology, design and so on. His teachers were some of the most esteemed professionals of the time. During this period, Wandrè had a terrible heartbreak because of love, and he attempted suicide. But fortunately some of his friends saved him. After the school, Wandrè began to manage building sites throughout Italy, especially in Emilia, Milan and Cosenza. In the same period, he was socially engaged, and he was interested in theatre acting. This is an old passion, really. Wandrè performed theatre since 1943 when he was a child. In 1952 was one of the founders and then the director of the local newspaper, Pies Nostra. In 1953 Wandrè was implicated in a serious incident at work where a scaffolding collapsed and 6 men died. Wandrè had no direct responsibility for what happened, but he was the work's director, and felt himself responsible of that tragedy. This experience causes a deep wound in his soul, that will remain open throughout his life. So, his character deeply changed, leading him to have an obsessive attention for the psychophysical well-being of his subordinates. In 1954 Wandrè married Ida Lucetti, and then they moved to Cosenza. But after 2 years Wandrè was very tired and disappointed by his work. because he was a very original person. He dressed eccentric, but especially he had care of his workers, and he strenuously defended them from any abuse or injustice. This creates a lot of friction with his superiors. Wandrè was unable to accept compromises, so he eventually resigned, and came back to Cavriago. Nevertheless, in Cavriago there were some new problems, because he had no work and he had a wife and a daughter to support. So, what to do? In the spring 1957, Wandrè decided to transform himself from a foreman to luthier. The reasons were three. First, he had a good family trade in lutherie. 2. The dance music was spreading in Italy after the war, and especially in Emilia-Romagna. Third, some friends of his were now professional musicians, and they could help him. On the other hand, lutherie was a good compromise because it is a creative work. In lutherie there is innovation, and lutherie allows testing, and freedom of expression. Lutherie allowed Wandrè to forget the negative experience in building, but don't lose his know-how, his experience, his cultural baggage, and all he learned at the boarding school. Really, Wandrè caused the greatest genetic mutation in the guitar design of the 20th century. Actually, Gibson design derived from the European lutherie of the 19th century. Modernistic guitar by Gibson are more innovative, but the perimeter of the guitars had just been broken by Luigi Mozzani and a lot of years before. Leo Fender introduced new genes in the design of the body of the guitar. But, in example, the typical Fender 6-inline hat really derives from the Austrian lutherie of the 19th century, Stauffer, Schank, and probably other Italians luthiers before them. Certainly, Wandrè is into the European tradition, but his design acquired an absolute autonomy. Wandrè transformed the musical instruments from work tools for musicians into bionic prostheses of the artist to transfer their emotions. The guitars of Wandrè can directly transfer emotions and energy, because of their shape, their colors, their new materials, and their many symbolism. Thanks to Wandrè, the guitar became, for the first time, an integral part of the stage set. We can identify 5 phases in Wandrè lutherie. The first period, before 1957, was a period of training with his father, and he made very few instruments as a hobby. This is the first guitar made by Wandrè at the age of 13. In the headstock there is the first Wandrè's logo, a little cat inlaid in celluloid. So, do you remember the nickname Gatina? Little Cat? And this is another guitar from the late 40s on a Roberto model, but the personality of Wandrè is peeking out. In fact, you see a high-erotic hidden game in graphics and materials. For bridge and tailpiece, Wandrè uses the horn, a material that has always been rich in erotic values. The profile of a girl wearing a hat is pierced on the tailpiece. Then, Wandrè used the classic drop-shape sound hole, but he reversed it to obtain a phallic allegory. The shape of the bridge alludes to the same allegory. And all this is very typical of Wandrè. Here another guitar with surrealistic harmonic holes. The ribs are decorated with the decoupage technique, and there is also an image of the champion of the world, the boxer Rocky Marciano. The second phase of Wandrè lutherie began in 1957 when Wandrè came back to Cavriago. He founded a company with his friend Enzo Cavecchi. Miazzi brothers and Athos Davoli provided him for pickups, tune machines, strings and so on. In the spring of 1957, Wandrè decided that he will be a luthier, but he did not want to be a craftsman, who works isolated in his workshop, jealous keeper of his own secrets. Instead, he wants to start a large-scale production of electric instruments because in Italy there is still no one who builds them. The problem, however, is that Wandrè doesn't have money, so he involved a friend, Enzo Cavecchi. Giacomo, Ensor's father, made available for the novel entrepreneurs a small space in his mechanical workshop. It was the place where started the production of Wandrè instruments. Below right we see the first group of the first workers hired. This is a very rare mandolin made by Wandrè in that period, with a paint of Lelio Lorenzani. Lorenzani was a realist painter and a good friend of Wandrè. He painted a lot of instruments, especially double basses and guitars. You must observe the signature, a double-pointed L overlap, drawing AW. So, a single graphic sign expresses the signature of both the authors Wandrè and Lorenzani. The double bass is the first instrument made in large amount by Wandrè. And you can observe the differences from the classic model and the new models of Wandrè. In that period, the most relevant problem for the bass players was the transport, because they were traveling especially by train. So Wandrè created the pocket bass, a double bass with removable neck. After the performance, the player can easily remove the neck, and put neck and body into a normal bag. And this is another model, the classic bass, where the personality of Wandrè is rising. There's new F-hole shape, a polyvinyl chloride binding and laminated multi-layer plywood, instead of the classic spruce, maple and poplar. But especially, we have tailpiece and bridge in aluminum. Despite of the classical music, in new music the players were using the pizzicato techniques. With pizzicato is so difficult to obtain great volume and sustain. So Wandrè used aluminum because he well knew that material. And he knew that aluminum transmits the sound vibration better than maple. So, aluminum allowed to obtain a major volume and sustain with pizzicato technique. With this solution, Wandrè transformed a double bass of vulgar plywood into a perfect instrument for swing and rock and roll. And this is Nika model. This is the cross point between all the past experiences of Wandrè and his attentions toward the future. The name is the acronym of NITA and Leica. NITA is a part of the scaffolding, in the slang of the consensus bricklayers. And do you remember the scaffolding collapse in the incident at work? Just as Wandrè tragically collapses the shoulder of this double bass. Whereas Leica was the first dog launched to space into the Sputnik 2, in November 1957. So, the past and the future. Really. In the design of this double bass there are also symbolic references to female body, to state of pregnancy, to the past love experiences, to political events, and other that we can read in literature. It is enough for us to look at the decorations of these instruments. At times with a realistic flavor, at times with elegant eroticism, at times a more playful eroticism. Some paintings recall Japanese manga, but above all we find psychedelic games, 10 years before the psychedelia. Nika is a very complex object by the semiotic point of view. Wandrè also introduces new futuristic design for the scrolls. As for the problem of transport, Wandrè decided to make also electric upright basses. He was not the first to make electric upright basses, but it was probably the first in Europe. And he was the first above all to make them with removable neck and then with folding neck. The first upright bass was the Mars. It was inspired by a space rocket, and we can observe the elegance of this asymmetric sidereal scroll and the elegance of all the details of this amazing instrument. And this is the oval model. This is an ultra-flat version of Nika, but it's incredible the refined eroticism that permeates the design of this instrument. There is an incredible lust. And all the metal parts of the frame reflect the light, as if they were jewels on the velvety skin of the female body. This is the quarry model. It is a tribute to Wandrè, born place. The soundboard is a very thin foil of plexiglass. This is the electro blitz bass where we can see the folding neck. After the performance, the musician retracts the tip, then loosens the strings, folds the neck, and places the instrument inside a case that takes up less space than a guitar. Sweden bass is the masterpiece of all the upright basses of the world. It is inspired by the North's Finnish culture, and the Swedish modernism architecture. But curiously, the wood is not a Norwegian or a Sweden wood, but the African paduk. And this is the Viking bass. It is inspired by Viking people, but on the body we have some cuttings resembling the pictograms of the Native Americans, as well as the bird's head present in some specimens. Would refer to the Native American culture. This bass is a tribute to the theory that the Vikings were the first discoverers of North America. In fact, it was designed in 1960 after the discovery of the Viking village of Newfoundland, Canada. And this is the first guitar made by Wandrè with the neck and the headstock in aluminum. But why aluminum? We will see it later. This is rock and roll model, probably inspired by sport fishing, of which Wandrè was a fanatic. The shape would be inspired by a fishing hook, and in some there is a fishing net drawn, in one specimen even a fishman. Nevertheless, there is probably more. Rock and roll certainly does not evoke a quiet afternoon of fishing, but it alludes to the most innovative, revolutionary and transgressive music that has never been heard. It is evident the ambiguity of these asymmetrical bulges, and it's incredible the immorality of this perimeter, as Pino Galizio would have defined it, as well as the cut of the sound holes. Are they frog tadpoles or are they spermatozoa? In short, Elvis put the pelvis and Wandrè all the rest, and all that is rock and roll. Harry Belafonte was spreading calypso dance from 1956. Wandrè was very excited and designed his calypso model, inspired by the dance, in 1957. Here, a wonderful calypso with a cubist-style paint by Lorenzani, that well reflect all the energy and ambiguity of Caribbean dance. This is the masterpiece of all the guitars, the BB model. It is dedicated to the global erotic dream of that period, the French actress Brigitte Bardot. The sound hole symbolizes a strapless bra floating in the wind. So, it's impossible to understand this guitar without taking it into your arms, the only way to discover the danger of these curves. The first version of BB had 2 sound hole, and then only 1. This is another BB with an even hidden game, if you squeeze your eyes, so you can observe a topless girl with a cap. She is hidden by the technique of pointillism. This is the triumph of the colors on BB. And this is to remember the good friend Ian Martin, a great Wandrè collector. We must consider, we are still in the late of the 51st 60s. And not in 1967, so really we must consider Wandrè a precursor of the psychedelia. This is WAID model. WAID is the acronym of Wandrè and Ida. Ida loved very much to dance. Instead, Wandrè didn't like dance. So, he dedicated to his wife this guitar where they are engaging in an imaginary dance. This is a wonderful example from 1959 with abstract decorations. And it is not entirely clear whether they were made by Lorenzani, or by Wandrè himself. On the right, we see the introduction of the alu backbone, an aluminum bar that goes from the headstock to the tailpiece, on which all the parts of the instrument are screwed. And these are WAID basses. The elegance of this instrument is amazing. Suspended halfway between the futurism of the aerospace headstock and the surrealism of the body, which looks like a Salvador Dali watch. Celine model is inspired by a night vision of the moon. In the first specimens there was a round hole, symbolizing the lunar craters. Here, we have some colored versions of Celine, with the candle smoke finish, as to remind us that there is the dark side of the moon too. At the end of the 1950s, all the people are enthusiastic of the space. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was also fighting in terms of the race to conquer space. All the people were dreaming about Martians and flying saucers. So, also Wandrè wants to pay an homage to flying saucer. And he did it with the rock oval model. The shape of the guitar is borrowed from rock and roll, but it also recalls the shape of a flying saucer, especially in reference to its oval section. This guitar has inspired many artists over the years. On the left, we have the homage of Pascal Colrat, who chooses the rock oval as a libertarian symbol. On the cover of the periodical Liberation. In the center, a shot by Jean-Baptiste Mondino, in his amazing Guitar Heroes, where Wandrè's guitars are the only ones to be portrayed alone, without the presence of models. Because there is no need, they perfectly express themselves. On the right, a pin from the Hard Rock Cafe. The rock oval is a psycho-cosmic object. It is impossible to describe, we simply have to observe it, and let the shapes and colors pass through our soul. Spatial model is another guitar dedicated to the space. The body is 990 grams, and all the instrument about 1.5 kilograms. It was thought that this model was from the third phase of Wandrè, Lutherie. Then, the discovery of this Miazzi catalogue from 1959, and of an instrument with the original label, confirmed it is from Phase 2. This device for adjusting the volume with the right arm is very curious. We have not an original one, so we do not know how it worked, probably bad. In fact, it was quickly removed. In 1959, Wandrè designed the Piper model for the Miazzi brothers of Milan. It was inspired by the Piper Cub airplane, a small economic airplane. Piper Cup was advertised as the airplane for everyone. The same thing wanted to be the guitar, an economic instrument for beginners. To contain production costs, Wandrè used wood instead of aluminum for head and neck. But in the second version he reintroduces the aluminum and cut a new shape of sound holes. At the same time, Wandrè made another cheap guitar, the Blue Jeans model, inspired to the famous trousers, that in 1958 were just worn by 90% of American girls but which in Italy were still banned in churches, restaurants and schools. To minimize the costs, we have still wood as in Piper. But now we have also no volume control, and no jack socket. In fact, the electric cable was directly attached to the pickguard. These are some colored blue jeans. The strange harmonic holes of the left guitar are due to the fantasy of the worker that cut them. Wandrè stimulated the creativity of his workers. They were free to make variations based on the inspiration of the moment. The Blue Jeans teenager version of 1961 had new sound holes, with plastic grids. And this is the Blue Jeans Major, a luxury version of Blue Jeans, with two pickup and a new pickguard, made by Athos Davoli. The evolution of the model had a concave soundboard. And the last version is a solid body, with larger tonal chambers under the pickguard. In that period Wandrè made also Hawaiian guitars, 3 different models, differing from each other for the shapes, the harmonic hole, and the number of pickups. And here, we can see Wandrè the 90s, with the musician Santo Farina, from the famous duo Santo and Johnny, composer of very popular pieces for Hawaiian guitar. Wandrè has been building guitars for only 2 years, but they are already very successful. His instruments are exhibited in international fairs, appear in the film, thanks to musician friends, and are in the hands of many professionals. It is now clear that the small space in Giacomo Cavecchi's workshop is no longer enough. So, a dedicated factory was needed. Thanks to the skills acquired at the convento school, Wandrè personally designed his own factory, a round factory. Wandrè itself planned the round factory in 1959, and building it with an innovative technique, the pre-stressed concrete. Pre-stressed concrete in that period was still theoretical. It was used for some experimental bridges but never to cover a building. I suggest you observing the incredulous face of this bricklayer during the building. Yet Wandrè was a visionary, because almost 10 years after, the same technique had been used in building the Madison Square Garden in New York. The round factory of Cavriago is therefore the first industrial building in the world built with this technique. But the true marvel of that, the utopian factory, was its philosophical conception. Wandrè was thinking that the work is not a natural condition for men, and the workers must be able to always see the sky, for remembering they were born free. So, we have glass all around the factory, on the ceiling, and a little garden in the middle. In this way, in addition to excellent lighting, wherever you're in the factory, you just need to raise your eyes, and see the sky directly. Wandrè left his workers freedom of expression, and he urged them to do variation to the instrument, according by the inspiration of the moment. So, one day the painter take a hen, dip the animal's legs in the paint, and then make it walk on the double basses to obtain new effects. Wandrè practiced a convocative leadership. He involved the workers in the organization of work, in the development of projects, and in the realization of advertising. There was a sharing of capital, so the workers had the keys to the factory. After the work, they can access it, and use the tools to carry out small personal jobs. Wandrè also worked to promote the personal development and aspirations of his employees. He helped some of them to learn a foreign language, or to play an instrument, or to learn technical drawing. And even he taught smoking to women, because he felt it was an important sign of emancipation for them. Wandrè elaborates his own recipe, that was able of expressing the best of the different doctrines on the philosophy of work. He unified them according to the emotional cultural matrix, with the right balance between science and humanism. Wandrè reconciled Taylorism with the modern dictates of the human relation movement and human resources, and thus anticipates humanistic management by almost 50 years. In the factory there was a continuous coming and going of artists. The painter Lorenzani, who was expressing himself extemporaneously on the instruments, and musicians, who tested the instruments, performed jam sessions, and interacted with the workers. The round factory was 4 years in advance of Andy Warhol's factory, albeit with different intentions. So, each Wandrè guitar have absorbed the creative energy of all the workers, and today it gives back to us. For this reason, Wandrè guitars are pieces of pop art, in particular, usable sculptures for music. These are some interiors of the rotund factory. Top left, Wandrè is sitting at the desk, and interesting is the coat rack, they're made with the scroll of the double basses. Wandrè designed also the furniture, and Lorenzani painted them. Bottom left, Wandrè together with a part of the workers. In the period of greatest activity the workers were about 30 elements, 40% of whom were women, which was quite unusual for those times. The third phase of Wandrè's lutherie began in February 1960, with the transfer of the business to the futuristic round factory, and the foundation of a new company with William Kavecki, Enzo's brother. The 87% of the production of this period will be for export. The first new model, the made in the round factory, was Bikini. It was inspired by the famous swimsuit, in fact. The guitar is also in 2 pieces, guitar and amplifier. The Italian vintage guru Stefano Aria defined Bikini the guitar of records, because it's the first guitar in the world with a built-in amplifier. In literature, we read that the first guitar of its kind would be the Hofner Fledermaus. But this is not true. The Hofner archives reveal that the Fledermaus was made in 1961, a year after the Wandrè Bikini. It is the first all-transistors guitar amplifier. Why transistors? This guitar was born from the requests of guitarists from Roma and Napoli. They were needing amplified guitars to play in courtyards, along the streets and among restaurant tables. So it was necessary an amplifier attached to the guitar, powered by batteries and with a good autonomy too. It is the first guitar outlined like a motorbike. Really, the design of the body derived from the collaboration with Athos Davoli. It results from a lot of experiments to solve the problem of Larsen effect. Nevertheless, Wandrè was a real biker. Here, we can see him wading a river aboard his Lagostina. Lagostina was a BSA motorcycle, nicknamed Lagostina because Wandrè had modified its tank, expanding it with 2 Lagostina pots. We have 2 versions of Bikini. The body changed in the second version, because of the necessity to insert into the body more D-size batteries for increasing the autonomy of the amplifier. Another masterpiece of Wandrè is the rock model. Some people are thinking this object was inspired by an ancient wooden Venus, or by tribal totem, or by the little man Bialetti designed by Paul Campani. Actually, Wandrè told he'd take inspiration for these instruments by the toilet seat he was starring as while he passed urine. So, here, Wandrè definitively desecrated the strongholds of the classic lutherie. He used void and air as building materials, like the sculptures of the contemporaries Henry Moore or Barbara Hepworth or Joe Ponti and so on. The different shape of the holes between different instruments is due to the different will of workers, or sometimes to the necessity to correct flaws in the wood. This is the 1961 Roby model, for celebrating the born of Roby, the second son of Wandrè, in September 1961. The profile represents a child with open arms. Then Roby undergone several small changes over the years. This is an advertising pic of Roby from 1963. Giovanna, the girl in the pic, was working in the round factory. She did not inform her husband of this photo shoot, because the catalogue was still destined for Northern Europe. But the husband was a truck driver, and one day, when he was crossing a city in Germany, he can see all the walls covered with posters, with winking photos of his wife together with Wandrè guitars. Twist model is inspired by Twist dance, and it looks like a Fender design. But here, we have an amazing balance of the curves, that better reflect the twist in the dance than Fender. On the right there are some version of Twist, and we can see an original shark bite. It is on the opposite side than the usual, so it became very ergonomic for the right arm. It was typical of Wandrè to observe the things, and ask himself, why they were done in that way. Why it was not possible to do them exactly the opposite. And then he tried to do. Sometimes with bad results, but sometimes with very good intuitions. This is the soloist model. This guitar was committed to Wandrè by the USA importer, Don Noble. Wandrè didn't love this guitar, because he felt it as an imposition of Noble. Nevertheless, the guitar is a very good instrument. The famous American guitarist Buddy Miller is always using it in all his live concerts. And this is the Powertone model. Another guitar imposed by Don Noble. This is the original proof of the brochure, with all the critical points to correct in the guitar. And this is Doris, or better Doris. Doris was the name of the girlfriend of the French importer of Wandrè guitars. He asked Wandrè to make a guitar to homage his girlfriend. He also gave Wandrè a draft design, because he wanted a modern guitar, looking like American guitars. Wandrè loved this guitar, because here he had more freedom of expression. In fact, Wandrè proposed to modify the original design, and fitting the measures of the guitar to those of Madame Doris. So, when we look at this guitar, we're really peeking at an alluring corset of Madame Doris. Even this model has undergone some variations over the years. The fourth phase of Wandrè, Lutherie, started with the dissolution of the company with William Kvecki. The first guitar was polyphone in 1964. There are three versions: polyphone alpha, beta and reverbero. The difference between these guitars are in the headstock, and in the bridge. Whereas polyphone reverbero had a reverberant system incorporated. This guitar is the most important pop piece of Wandrè. First, because the profile is that of the Brigitte Bardot, which was the most popular erotic dream at that time. Second, because of the material was is formica, the material used for the most popular American kitchen in that period. And then, because these instruments are guitars and basses, so the most popular instrument in the world. In those years, all but had nothing to do with the space, probably had the name of wild animals. So it was for the cars, motorbikes, and the guitars too. Wandrè designed two guitars inspired by wild animals, tigre and cobra. Tigre looks very like to Fender design. But in here we have just more kindness and dynamism. Nevertheless, it is evident that the time were changing, and that Wandrè needed to have in his catalogue some more traditional instruments. Here we can see Cobra, in first and second version. Cobra is aligned with the Tigre, but Wandrè just cannot manage to give up his freedom. It can be clearly seen, in the cut of the headstock. It also perceived from the upper part of the body, where traces of flower power is appearing. In the second version, we can observe the pickguard and the headstock with the skin of the snake, and the head of the snake with the eyes and the forced tongue. On 1964, there were in Italy two important archaeological discoveries regarding the Etruscan world, so Etruscans became very popular. Wandrè explored the mysterious world of the Etruscan by means of this instrument, the Etrurian bass, in first and second version. The body is inspired by an Etruscan vase. But really, it is a very powerful phallic metaphor, where the backbone of the long neck flows into the atavistic vulva symbol, which is the upturned triangle. Here, the designer Stefano Beltrami will subsequently affix a clitoral appendix, underlining the concept. The very explicit image on the back is the original image of the brochure of 1966, which leaves no room for imagination. On summer 1965 there was the Italian tour of the Beatles. After the Beatles' performances, Wandrè and the young freelance designer Stefano Beltrami worked all the summer. And then they presented the new model of guitar, the Scarabeo. The body was inspired to the body of a Beatle, and for the head they took inspiration by the features of John Lennon's face. And here, Wandrè and Stefano performed a prophetic action, because due to a technical problem related to the housing of the tune machines, it was necessary to lengthen the bob of John's hair, which at that time was not so long. And this is exactly how we will see John, a few years later. We have a version of Scarabeo. The major difference is in the position of the selectors. On the left, the 1986 guitar player poster with the Scarabeo, winner of the Miss Off the Wall competition, preserved for the most bizarre guitars discovered by collectors during the year. Frank Zappa chaired the jury. It awarded the second prize to another Wandrè, and a rock oval. On the right, Sean Ono Lennon, the son of John and Yoko Ono, with his beloved Scarabeo. The last phase of Wandrè, Lutherie, started in 1967, with the affiliation to the commercial company Regio Impex. Now things are going really badly for Wandrè from a commercial point of view. However, he does not give up on creating new models. The first model of this period was the Mini, a very short diapason instrument. It was inspired by the miniskirt, that in that period was spreading also in Italy. In 1966, the Innocenti factory started the production of the Mini car, in Italy. There were songs praising the Mini, and the whole world was Mini. It is an extremely interesting model, because, as you can see, the shapes are truly a flower power masterpiece. And this is the last guitar made by Wandrè in April 1967, psychedelic sound. Wandrè exactly did the same thing that Allen Ginsberg had done few years before. When all the boys wore their hair short, Allen Ginsberg had it long at the back. When all the guys start growing their hair, he almost shaves to zero. Similarly, Wandrè had been doing the craziest things in guitar making for 10 years. But now that everyone wants to be original and do strange things, Wandrè thinks that the most revolutionary thing to do is to go back to basics. So, he designs a traditional instrument, with a headstock that we can define anonymous. It recovers the classic harmonic holes, never used in its life, and even recovers the thread embedded in the body of the instrument. The sound of this guitar is acid and lysergic, a Jefferson Airplane-like sound. On the other hand, you see that, a few months later, the Great Summer of Love exploded, in San Francisco. Nevertheless, with or without psychedelic sound, we must certainly consider Wandrè a precursor of psychedelia. In fact, he had already made his social and psychedelic revolution 10 years earlier, with his incredible usable sculptures for music, and with his utopian round factory.
I see what brings me here. It's a mother to all my wanderings. The valleys green will age with me. Its dirt will shine and linger. And girls will come in festive clothes, and the boys will wait gazing, and birds will sing from tops of trees, and sound like falling angels.
Wandrè introduced many technical innovations in the field of guitar making. Unfortunately, those innovations were then relegated to oblivion, because of the dominance of the American construction method, that is much simpler, and, above all, much cheaper. However, in the last 20 years, many luthiers in Europe, United States, Japan and Australia have taken up Wandrè solutions, and have re-proposed them. And they are reworking them in a modern key. So, an important research is going on. Wandrè was not the first to introduce aluminum in lutherie, but it was the first to use aluminum in building the neck and bridge. In 1958, Aluminum Company of Americas made a double bass with the aluminum neck. Really, the neck was not in aluminum, but in wood, and aluminum was only a thin cover. Wandrè used aluminum to lighten the structure, to avoid the neck hump, and extortion, and to keep the right tilt of the neck on the body. The X-ray microanalysis reveals that Wandrè used the anti-corrodal aluminum, series 6000, and not the duraluminum, as we often read in some papers, and on the web. The lightness was a very obsession for the Pioli family. Wandrè was finding it for his flying machine, and Wandrè for his guitars. But it was also a necessity, because you must know that the musicians, in that period, started to play at the 9 p.m. till to the 2 or 3 a.m. so, having light instruments was a necessity. As for to regulate the right tilt, Wandrè reintroduced a tilting device, with a long screw-through body. This idea was not very original, but Wandrè mechanism is really the best, and very easy to use. The second system was the alu backbone through-body system. A bar of non-deformable aluminum and all the part of the guitar screwed on. In 1961 the backbone was divided into 3 pieces. The head screwed to the neck, and the neck screwed to the through-body bar of aluminum. All the instrument of Wandrè had the system to regulate the intonation. The masterpiece of these systems was the string suspending bridge, where we have a screw for the micrometric regulation of intonation, and where the strings are suspended on the void, so to have less inertia and more sustain. As for warming system, the masterpiece was the floating cylinder. It's difficult to display the operation of this mechanism, but the pictures speak for themselves. As for the varnish, we must remember Gianfranco Borghi, nicknamed Bongo, is the man who painted almost all Wandrè guitars. At the beginning, he used shellac and alcohol, then nitrocellulose, then polyester and then polyurethane. In this picture, we can see Gianfranco displaying the technique to obtain the famous candle smoke finishing. It is requested to smoke the guitar when the varnish is still fresh, for attacking the smoke. If the candle is too far from the body, it's impossible to obtain this effect. And if the candle is close to the body, the fresh varnish flare up, so making these finishing is very difficult. Another classic finishing of Wandrè was the sparkle. We don't know if Wandrè was the first to introduce the sparkle system, but as he was the man who set the modern technique, till now used. At the beginnings, they were spreading silicate particles on the fresh varnish, and then a layer of transparent varnish, and then sanding and polishing. In a second time, Gianfranco, together with Wandrè and some technicians of the Max Meyer Varnish Company, modify the painting gun, so it became possible to mix the silicate particles directly to the varnish. On the bottom right, we have a scanning electron microscopy image of the silicate metal particle, top left, and the transparent layer, right and bottom. Here are some instruments in different finishing stages. And then, a more detailed image of a can of diluent from the Duco brand. Why this image? Because remembering that on the other side of the ocean, there was another man loving this thinner, he was Mr. Jackson Pollock. On the left, however, we have our local Gianfranco Borghi, struggling with painting. Many thanks goes to him, because without his archive, his knowledges, and his precious help, it would have been impossible to find all the material for writing the biography of Wandrè. It's possible to date Wandrè guitars on the base of comparative tables. As for the headstocks, the pick guards, and the pickups, and the knobs, and the dots, and the tailpieces, and the logos in the labels, and on the base of both the original broches and picks. As for electronics, we must remember Atos Davoli. He was the man who planned all the electrical circuit of Wandrè guitars, and he made the most of the pickup used by Wandrè. He also introduced in 1966 an electric coil to modify the tone of the bass. On December 31, 1968, the Round Factory closed its doors. It is the end of this wonderful utopia, that had seen the imagination driving an industry. A factory where there was not a single strike during 8 years of activity, in the 1960s. Really, there was only one, but it was Wandrè who led all his workers, and bring them to join another demonstration in Reggio Emilia. A factory where the workers decided to give free work days to their manager, to help him, when things go wrong. The ex-workers we interviewed said that the work in the Round Factory was not work but fun. A factory where the unionists distrust Wandrè, because the very reason for the existence of labor unions would has a crisis, if all managers had begun to follow his model. So, why does the Round Factory close? The factory closed because Wandrè was an artist, and he was unable to accept compromise and suggestion, and because he absolutely had no commercial ability. Suffice it to say that there were those who ordered him 100 red instruments and he instead sent them the colors he wanted, because he did not tolerate seeing so many identical instruments come out of his factory, so he sent to the buyers the colors he wanted, and not the ordered ones. In South Africa he even sent only completely white lacquered instruments to protest against apartheid. He also lacquered the paduk with and white, also the dots, and so commercial relations failed. The factory closed because of a growing competition. In the early 60s a very powerful electro-musical industrial center began to develop in the Marche region, and it was capable of producing thousands of instruments a year, at a very low prices. Foreign competition is also growing, especially from Sweden, Germany, and England. The round factory closed because there was a great problem with USA protectionism. Wandrè was blocked by deceptive contracts. American music shops were directly asking Wandrè to send them guitars, but he could not. Requesting letters arrived in Cavriago until 1972, 4 years after the factory closed. In the 1967 film Don't Look Back, Bob Dylan is looking in amazement at a couple of Wandrè guitars, in a music shop of London, and exclaims, "They don't have those guitars in the States." The factory closed because the time is indifferent to the feelings of men. Each generation has its music, and its new idols. And the young musicians like to play the guitar and the basses of their new idols. But now the new idols were not playing Italian instruments. After the guitars, Wandrè expressed his creativity in different way. He worked the leather and hide together with his wife Ida, clothing and accessories, such as belts, hats, bags, shoes and so on. Wandrè was a biker who crossed Europe on a motorcycle, has customized motorcycles and made leather motorcycle accessories. Top right, Wandrè is with Phil Reed, the motorcycling champion, in 1974. On 1976 Wandrè met the gallery owner and art director, Rosanna Chiesi. Rosanna had moved to Cavriago and settled in an old farmhouse. Involving part of the population, she quickly transformed Cavriago into a reference point for all the artists of the Fluxus movement, and not only, in transit through Europe. Wandrè and Rosanna followed in love, and Wandrè joined Fluxus. It was a very intense period for Wandrè, because he was in contact with artists from all over the world, collaborates with them, and materially realizes many of the works conceptually conceived by the artists staying in Cavriago. Top left, Wandrè with the artist Vito Mazzotta, and the Spanish poet Rafael Alberti. Wandrè with Philip Corneran in the Tuscan house of Umberto Eco. Bottom left, Wandrè in Capri with the Polish artist Margaret Raspe, during the performance, Breakfast at Dawn, in the middle of the water. Wandrè during a dinner with Roberto Benigni, and with the Japanese artist Takako Sato. Here, Wandrè and the American cellist Charlotte Moorman were performing Cut Piece by Yoko Ono. On the left, Wandrè having dinner with his friend Herman Nitsch. On the right, the American Joe Jones, one of the many artists based in Cavriago. The love story of Rosanna and Wandrè ended dramatically in 1990. Wandrè turns into a real stalker, so much that Rosanna must left Cavriago. Wandrè fell into a deep depression. He was hospitalized in a mental hospital, and then he planned his slow suicide by means of smoke and alcohol. "I drink for remembering, I smoke to kill myself." Usually, it is said that a man drinks to forget, but it is not true. Because during the first phases of alcoholic intoxication the strongest melancholic and nostalgic memories come to the surface, and the alcoholic illusion makes us believing that it will be possible to relive those lost moments. In this period Wandrè likes to define himself as an artist of life, because he is reciting the script of his own life, and does it on the stage of everyday life. All the works he creates are the pages of his romance of life. In this period, Wandrè produces a lot of dresses, paintings, sculptures, assemblages, murals, graffiti, installations, mail art, junk art, trash art, performances, body art, and so on. With these works, he spoke about ecology, peace, freedom, politics, and he constantly fight against all what he believes to be hypocrisies and injustices. So, he became very unpleasant for the local politicians, and he was ostracized by the well-meaning people. In 2000 his health conditions worsened, and he was hospitalized in a protected structure, where he remained until his death. Here we can see some example of graphic works with different techniques, including pyrography. Here clothes. Many of them were inspired by the culture of the natives of North America. Here's sculptures. In the center, there is the opera. The TV grinds brains, made with a grinder to make tomato puree. Just as tomatoes enter this machine as individual entities, one different from the other, and then a homogeneous mush comes out. The same thing would do the television with the brains and consciences of the men. Here we see Wandrè busy, making murals. Here we have some examples of installations, and there would be a lot to say for each of these works. Here's some example of Wandrè expressions in mail art, junk art, trash art. He had a great respect for the environment and supported the need to always give a second chance to objects that had already lived a previous life. We have some examples of assemblages, and there would be a lot to say for each of these work. Here two installations from 1993. On the left the Goddess of Love, and on the right, Even in Hawaii Ye Have the Face You Have. Here Wandrè was arguing against travels, no more intended as a means of expanding consciousness and knowledge, but rather as a trophy, to be exhibited upon returning from exotic countries. So, we can mirror ourselves and see our faces framed by a toilette seat, instead of the Hawaiian floral wreath. There is the writing, Even Hawaii Ye Have the Face You Have. As to say, if you are a asshole, you can also go to the Hawaii, but you stay asshole. Wandrè had an innate predisposition to performance, even before joining the Fluxus movement. Wandrè did the first performance in Cavriagor 5 years in advance of Fluxus' arrival. On June 1972 Wandrè wanted to turn in a sculpture an enormous rock in the Parvis of Cavriagor. On night his friends covered the rock with pitch and feathers. Wandrè saw some potential in it, but the mayor ordered to remove the stone. So Wandrè organized the funeral of the stone. That was the funeral of the freedom of expression, overwhelmed by the conformism of the local council. Here we see Wandrè in Sainte-Marie de la Mer in France in 1972. He was intent on writing the hands during the popular festival of the Black Madonna. There were gypsies who read the hands. Instead Wandrè was writing the hands. The meaning is profound. Wandrè wants to underline the concept that destiny is not a road traced indelibly on the line of a hand, but a path that the man can at least in part draw and write himself. The friend of Wandrè, Herman Nitsch, was a Viennese actionist. He celebrated cleansing rituals to denouncing man's cruelty to nature and animals. In 1995, Wandrè was denouncing nature cruelty to men in his performance, Odysseus 69, tribute to the friend Herman. For this performance, Wandrè demanded a photographer in the operating room during his aneurysm surgery. And in the end, here he is signing the artwork. And this is the last home of Wandrè, an incredible loft named the Tavern of Eternal Peace. There was no lock in this house, because Wandrè thought lock is a negative symbol. He said, if you are locked out, you are not free to enter. And if you are locked in, you are not free to go out. Whether you are closed in or out, you are always excluded. In 1995 Wandrè recovered some bases, and turned them into new artworks. Then, at the end of his contorted psychodynamic process, Wandrè turned also himself into a double bass by means of this performance, the auto double bass, where, at the end, he played himself. In the later 90s, a lot of guys give their guitar to Wandrè for customization, which usually consisted in a paint, or a signature, and so on. The bass player Martin Iotti gave his Fender Precision to Wandrè. When Martin returned to take the bass, Wandrè lifts a cloth and presents this work, the Wandrè, generated by the Phantom collaboration Fender-Wandrè. The bass was full of holes on the body and along the ribs. Wandrè also gave Martin a plastic bag with the sawdust producing during milling, and said to him, "Look at this, I have lightened it by exactly 1 kilogram, now you can even play." Martin was desperate, and very angry, and accused Wandrè of having ruined a precious instrument. But Wandrè told him, "Martin, you are a fool. You understand nothing. When I die, this bass will be priceless." So, the resigned Martin accompanied Wandrè to Lenin Square, in Cavriago, for his last performance. Here Wandrè told Lenin that Americans are not able to make basses because they made them too much heavy. Wandrè died the 15th of August 2004, freeing himself of all his freedom. From 2014 we are progressively spreading the wandritis, which is a very serious disease, extremely contagious illness, and from which one can never recover. These are some of the artists so far infected, and, as you can see, we are in an excellent company. Thank you very much for your attention.